Welcome to Behind the Page, the Eli Marks podcast, with your hosts, John Gaspard and me, Jim Cunningham.
Hey there, Jim.
Jono, how are you, buddy?
I'm good. You're on the couch this week. A lot of times you're in the kitchen. People don't know the difference. The difference is that the dogs are relaxed right now.
That's right. If I'm in the kitchen, the dogs believe that they can then say, I'd like to go out. I'd like to come in. I'd prefer to go out again. Do you mind if I come back in? Because there's treats involved in that process.
Yes.
So I have moved to the couch this week because when I'm on the couch, they believe that it's time to just rest. You can see one of them right there.
Well, I can.
Rest with me. So, yeah, you can. Not everybody can, but one's between my legs, one's in my lap, and one's at my feet. I've got three. Yes, I do. Is there a problem with three dogs? Mind your own business. Yeah, not you, John.
Two greyhounds laying at my feet, and they do love to. Nothing puts them to sleep faster than us recording a podcast.
Well, I'm going to try that right now with my dogs. The only thing we have to worry about is every 15 minutes, my grandmother's clock is going to ring.
Well, we're going to cut that out. So listeners, you probably won't hear that.
All right.
Anyway, we are episode 9 of season 4, and this is one I've been waiting for a while. I think I mentioned last time that I'd had Professor Richard Wiseman on my list for a long, long time and couldn't figure out exactly what to talk to him about. And there is so much you can talk to him about. He is... I wrote it down. He has the professorship in public understanding of psychology at the University of Hertfordshire and has over 100 academic papers. Makes him sound boring. He is not. He is a stitch. He has a podcast, which I think we talked about last time. You guys should listen to. No, I know we talked about it because I put it in the show notes.
Yeah, we did. We talked about it.
It's all coming.
I was worried that they'd jump from our podcast to his podcast and we'd never hear from him.
It's all coming back. You know, you'd think every 2 weeks be easy to remember than every month. Still, anyway, yes, his podcast, Richard Wiseman's On Your Mind, is absolutely a must listen to anyone interested in psychology or magic or spirits or ghosts or he's just
cool. It's just cool stuff.
It's just cool.
And here's the deal, as I think I mentioned when we recorded last, no frame of reference. So again, our friendship has a huge benefit for me because I had no idea this guy existed. And now I am an enormous fan of Dr. Richard Wiseman. He's a spellbinder. He
is. So I brought you into the world of London After Midnight, which you didn't know much about.
Exactly.
And now we're into the amazing world of Dr. Richard Wiseman. There's so many things we cover in here. In fact, it was the sheer number of possible topics to cover with him that it kept me from reaching out in the first place. I've had your name on my list of people to talk to. This is now our 4th season. And every time I go down the list, and as you saw, we've talked to some really amazing. The magic community is so great. People will talk to us. And I kept skipping by your name. Why am I afraid to reach out? Why am I afraid to reach out? And as I was reading through some of the studies that you have done, I was reminded of one that was done years ago, maybe at Stanford University, where they did a study in a grocery store where they had a big stack, like 24 kinds of jam on the table, and nobody bought them. And the next day they had 6 jams on the table and they sold like crazy. And they realized that too much choice can be paralyzing. And that's the problem with you, sir, is you are too many jams.
Too much choice. I've too much choice. People often said that of me. They said, the problem with you, Wiseman, is you're like 24 jars of jam, they've said.
Well, it's true. There's too much choice. So
yes. How are we going to cut the jam jars down to a manageable size?
I think I have, although it's still, there might be 7 or 8 instead of 6. So I'm just going to get right to it. I know you've told this story before, but I like the lesson out of it, which is your first magic trick that your grandfather taught you. Can you kick off with that story? Because I think it's really indicative of a good way to learn magic.
Thank you. Yes, so I would have been probably about 7 or 8, which is this weird age where most people learn or get into magic, certainly of my generation. And so I'd go and visit my grandfather at the weekends. He only knew one magic trick. He wasn't a magician, but he'd learned one magic trick during the war, and it was a good one. I'd put my initials on a coin. He'd make it disappear. He would then come up with this little metal tobacco box sealed with elastic bands. Magicians will know where I'm going with this. I would take the bands off the box, open the box. Inside there was another box with more bands. I take those bands off, open that box. Inside was a cloth bag. Inside the cloth bag was the coin with my initials on. And it was a really, really great trick. He only knew the one, but he could perform it very well. And so I would pester him. And I would say, please tell me how this was done. And he was quite wise. And so he wouldn't tell me for all sorts of good reasons. Magicians hold on to their secrets. But he did say the answer was in a book, and the book was in my local library. That was rather clever thing to say because I'm dyslexic. So writing and reading is not the easiest thing for me to do in the world. But boy, was I motivated to go and read stuff in the library. So I went and read all the magic books there, got hooked on magic, found out eventually how that trick was done. And that was my kind of inroad into magic.
What a clever way to get you on board.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And it must have worked because here we are years later and you are a magician and so much more. But here's something that blew me out of the water when John and I were talking about this interview. For those of us here in America, the Magic Circle is sort of the gold standard, certainly in England. And you were admitted to the Magic Circle at 17 years old.
I lied about my age. I think 18 is the cutoff. But I told them, I told them that I was 18. And so, I went from being interested in magic in my local magic club. I was born in a place called Luton, which is just slightly north of London. So I joined the local magic club there, got into magic. I was very lucky to have very good mentors who looked after me and taught me how to learn magic the proper way, i.e. reading books and actually going out and performing for real people. And then joined the circle, when I was, 17, supposed to be 18. Yeah.
What did your act look like at that point?
It's always been dreadful. I'm proud of the fact that hopefully it's always fun, but it has been consistently awful. So I did an act themed around Coca-Cola, which so Coca-Cola bottles and lids would appear and disappear. And of course, what's great about magic is this tremendous sense of community. So all of my friends, one of which came round and spent several hours with me this morning, who are of my age, I've grown up with them. So I knew them when I was 17 or 18. These are now very long-term friends. And of course, most of them do remember the Coca-Cola act. Many of them can't sleep because of it. They still pull my leg about it. It was not a good act. It was dreadful. And so that was my act. And then a few things happened, actually. I did street magic in Covent Garden, which is in the middle of London, a big sort of street entertaining area. That was with another psychologist friend of mine.
Can you tell us what that act was? Because that was
really bad. That was the only act that was worse than the Coke act.
Wow.
Appalling.
I've seen acts in Covent Garden.
Yeah,
and
they're good.
That is a tough... It's not a room, it's a space.
It's a huge space, and people have the right and ability to vote with their feet by walking away, and people exercise that right when we were performing. So we were there for one summer. My colleague, Adrian, who is a comedy juggling act, he's now gone on to be a very, very famous neuro scientist. But at the time we're doing comedy juggling, and we were so bad. I mean, they're still booing. If you go down there, they are still booing that act.
Yeah. It echoes within because of the columns and all that. Yeah.
I can't go anywhere near Covent Garden in case I get recognized 30 years later. And we had no money. And my girlfriend was a nutritionist. I said, how can we survive with no money? And she said, you should eat porridge, which I'm not so much called in America. Oats, isn't it? Oats in America, I think, something like that.
Yep.
With grapefruit segments chopped into it, because that will prevent you getting scurvy. And if you have that, you will at least survive. And that's what we survived on for about 3 or 4 weeks in Covent Garden, earning no money at all. And then we did a tour of the South Coast with the Captain Fearless Magic Show, which was even worse than the Coke Act and the Covent Garden show.
But it was different. It was a different act.
It was a different show. We'd managed to take the essence of poor quality and put it into a different show. So that was bad as well. And then I went to the Magic Castle 2 or 3 times with my terrible act and decided to become a psychologist.
So let me just this at this point, when you're when you're performing in Covent Garden and you're doing a tour of the Captain Fearless, were you? I mean, was the intention to become a performer, or was this more of a kind of an experiment as a psychologist?
No, it certainly wasn't an experiment as a psychologist. Ever since I was a kid, probably since an 8-year-old, I thought being a professional magician would just be the best way to earn a living, and my naivety. And then I tried to do that by doing, close-up magic, as it was back then, and at the castle and the circle. I suddenly realized you're on the road all the time. You were performing antisocial hours. It was a pretty stressful thing to do, as most magicians know. You've got to turn up, you've got to fool a bunch of strangers that you never met before, and try and be occasionally funny and charismatic. And so I decided that it wasn't for me, and that luckily the audiences agreed that it wasn't for me either. So, and I got into psychology because of magic. I read Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And I got very interested in social psychology. I'm a social psychologist now. I got into Carnegie's book because of a Edward Morris book called Showmanship and Presentation. And so he makes the point that the one thing magicians should be is likable. And so that you should read Carnegie's book to be likable. And that was my pathway into psychology. So I pretty much have magic to blame for most of my life. But I mean, you mentioned the podcast, my podcast I've been doing, and Marnie, my co-host, she has this phrase now, is that she always says, it all comes back to magic, doesn't it? Because whatever direction we go in on that podcast, there's normally a story that circles back around to magic. So I owe my life to it pretty much.
I will have a link in the show notes to the podcast. I can't recommend it highly enough. I will ask up front here that you hold Britain's only professorship in the public understanding of psychology. What does that mean?
It's so I'm quite passionate about psychology. I love psychology. I like people, and psychologists do experiments with people and find out things about the way they think and behave. But often they only report those things to other psychologists in quite difficult to read books and even harder to read academic papers. And I'm a kind of conduit. My idea is that I take that stuff and make it far more accessible for the general public. So I've written books, I give talks, the podcast and so on, which, really takes this wonderful world of psychology and hopefully makes it a bit more digestible for folks outside of psychology.
Yeah, it makes it much more accessible. I think I've read all of your books. I'll have links to those as well, but you've taken sometimes stuffy things,
very stuffy things,
made them much more accessible, and you're also not shy about saying this was really stuffy, or this particular study was interesting, but it doesn't have anything to do with reality. So we went out and did our own study about reality, and one of those I want to ask you about, because I think it's going to be as your co-host said, everything comes back to magic. You did a study on the role of blinking in magic tricks. Can you summarize what you learned there?
Yeah, so I'm a little bit skeptical about a lot of the psychology of magic stuff. I mean, magicians are great psychologists. They're going out every night and doing an experiment. The experiment is the trick, and that experiment has to work. And their experiments are far more successful than my experiments as psychologists. I'm lucky if my experiments work on 70% of the room. Theirs has to work on 100%. Otherwise, it's a bad night. So magicians know a lot about psychology. What I did with the blinking studies was I was interested, in just the act of blinking, which it turns out isn't random. We often think it is. But actually what we're doing when we need to blink, A, for physiological reasons, but B, in order to kind of, it resets the mind, as it were. There's a great deal of visual information coming in. It's overwhelming. We blink to shut down the mind to reset. So we need to blink psychologically. The question is, when do we do it? And the answer is when we're predicting that nothing particularly interesting is happening in front of our eyes. And so when you watch people watching a film, they all blink at the same time because they're normally all making the same prediction about, okay, this is not particularly interesting for this moment, we'll blink. My thought was, does that extend to magic? And that is when the magician is doing something sneaky, often it's done on the offbeat, on the moment when the audience relax their attention, maybe when the magician makes a joke or makes them laugh. And so my prediction is that secret stuff for certain types of routines would be highly correlated, highly related to when people are blinking. So we had people watch Teller perform his amazing silverfish routine, which is where he's plucking coins from the thin air. And lo and behold, yes, people are blinking when he's doing secret stuff. So it's a nice insight into the complexity, I think, of magic. That magicians understand when people relax their attention. When they do, they blink, and that's when secret things are happening.
You know, you're making me think of an interview I read years ago with a director who's making the movie Psycho 2. And it's been enough years now that I can give some spoilers. At the end of Psycho 2, Norman Bates picks up a spade, a shovel, and he's standing behind a woman who's seated at a table, and he swings the shovel and whacks her quite hard in the head for reasons of his own. And it doesn't quite work, because you can tell something switched. There's something going on. There's something going on there. And I remember reading an interview with the director saying he wasn't admitting that it didn't work. What he said was, we made that switch right at the moment when the shovel's hitting the head, because we figured that's when everybody would blink. And I think he found out just the opposite, that nobody was blinking at the moment the shovel hit the head. He picked the wrong moment to make that switch.
And in fact, intuitively, as magicians, you would never make the switch at that moment. Mm-hmm. You know, we all know there are moments before that when you would make the switch. So that I think magicians' intuition, the ones that invent magic and perform a lot, is kind of incredible. You know, that you know whether something will fly or not. I mean, you occasionally get it wrong, but you normally have got a feeling for, yes, this will fool people, or no, it won't.
It ties back to Darwin Ortiz and his writings on time misdirection, spatial misdirection, and those were, for writing the Eli Marks mysteries, the stuff that Darwin wrote was the greatest, because it also ties into crimes, where you want to put some time between what you're doing, when you want to put some distance and all that. So that blinking, I will have a link to your website, and I would just tell everyone, take an afternoon, boil some tea, sit down. You're going to read some really, really interesting studies. But we want to turn now to the patron saint of this podcast. Eugene Berger has probably been mentioned on every single episode. Jim was lucky enough to study with him. I spent a weekend with him here in Minneapolis when he came to perform. So we were very, very, very lucky to have that amount of time we had with him. What was your introduction to his work, and what impact did that make on the way you looked at magic?
Well, the introduction was inadvertent in that I would have been working with close-up magicians. I would think, now I spoke to Jeff McBride about this, and he knew the exact date. It's when Eugene came through London to give a close-up lecture. It would have been 80-something. And I went along to see the close-up lecture. And right at the end of it, he says, well, I've got this new book out called Spirit Theatre, and I've only got one copy, and it's about doing fake seance stuff. So I bought that copy. He wrote in a very nice inscription to me, and that copy now sits probably about 10 yards away in my magic room opposite here, and had probably more impact on me than any other magic book. Because when I read about the seance stuff, I thought, oh my goodness, this is a Victorian darkroom seance. You're putting people into total darkness. Luminous objects are moving around. What could be more fun? This is what I want to do. And so I played around with some of the techniques with that, and then went to a very a regional magic convention to perform my coke act. It was awful. It was still awful. And it had, I know there are non-magicians listening to this, so I'll be careful what I say. Had a particular technique involved in it, which in order to make objects vanish. And boy, was that not happening that day. The objects were reappearing everywhere where they shouldn't be reappearing. I barely got through the 8 minutes of the act. Sitting in the front row was a man I'd never met before, who found this as funny as I did. And afterwards he came up and he said, nothing has made me laugh as much as that for a couple of months. And that man was Andy Nyman. And Andy kindly gave me a lift back to London, and it turned out he was fascinated by seances too. So all the early seances we did from the Burger Book were done with Andy. So, and since then I've probably done, I don't know, 150 of them, something like that. And it all traces back to Eugene and that book.
I have to tell you that we got one of the sweetest, nicest no thank yous from Andy about being on this podcast that I still treasure. It was like, wow, I feel like I've been gifted with something here. Thank you very much. So, Jim, why don't you just bring us up to speed with your interest in spirit theater, and then we can talk about these seances, because you've done similar stuff.
Yeah. I got a copy of Spirit Theater here in Minneapolis, a local magic dealer that I frequent. When I walked into his shop in 1986, I think, he said, "Hey, a book just came out you've been waiting for your entire life." And it was a $50 book at that point, which was a lot of money to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I said, "Gosh, I would love to buy this, but I just don't have the money right now." And I went to a poker game that night with some of my high school buddies and won $60. And I went back the next day and bought the book. And after reading it, was completely convinced that I had to do it. And so I reached out to Eugene. I just, it was long before there was any kind of internet or Google or anything like that. But I called information in Chicago and got his number and called him up and just said, "Hey, I'm interested in performing hauntings. I'd like to know if you've sold the rights to anybody. And I'd like to," and he said, "Who is this?" And I said, "Well, I'm just a guy in Minneapolis who's interested in this. And, I'd like to," and he said, "Well, you know what, call me in a week." And so I said, "Okay." So I called him in a week and he said, "Oh, right. Yes. I'm just going to the dentist. Can you call me in a week?" And I said, "Yes, I can call you in a week." So I called him in a week, and then we started to talk. And later he told me that's my standard protocol for somebody who calls me and wants to work with me. I put them off a couple of times to see if they're really serious. So we became friends, and he allowed me to do his show Hauntings, with the caveat that I fly to Chicago and learn from him. And then I bring him to Minneapolis so that he could work with us on the back end, the darkroom sequence. And I would set up a lecture for him here in Minneapolis. And that was the genesis of, I would say, the last 30 years of my life have sort of jumped off from that point. He was incredibly generous to me. He said, "I don't want any money." He got Richard Kaufman to agree that I could use the material. He told me flat out, "There is no script. You're going to have to create your own script." And so, but he was enormously influential in my life, and really gave me a whole bunch of things that, a man at his level shouldn't have to give to a guy at my level, where I was at that point. And we saw things completely differently. I was a young man at that point and said to him, "There's no way that I can do the front half of this show the way I see it and carry the back half." And he said, "That's no problem. What we want to do is find someone else then to be the medium, to be the spirit medium. And you do the front half of the show, and then we'll introduce a spirit medium who will do the back half of the show." And that worked like a charm. I found a brilliant actress here in Minneapolis. And so I would do essentially an hour of comedy magic that said, in a nutshell, how could anybody fall for any of this stuff? And then I would create a magic illusion that Eugene taught me that would go, "Oh, well, that's how you'd fall for it. It's just so amazing." And then she would come out, and the entire atmosphere of the room would change because she was such a great actress. And I would leave, and she would be in charge, and the audience would immediately get, and Eugene conceived this moment where the last thing she would do before she called for the lights out, she had a razor blade in her hand, and she would cut her wrist and it would bleed, and then she would call for lights. So that was the last thing the audience saw before she went into The Ballad of the Harp Weaver. And it was extraordinarily successful. I did it for many, many years. Now I'm an older guy, and I do a version of that show at Halloween, where I do feel I'm to a point in my evolution as a performer where I can do both the front and the back. Although the place I do it, I can't achieve total darkness, so I do sort of a dim light seance. But it seems to please people, and I've had a whale of a time with that material.
Well, that's amazing. I'm so jealous you had that time with Eugene. I mean, very generous guy, and also, you know, he could really perform this stuff. It's
Oh, yeah.
really hard to do. You read all these books and you think you've never done that, and then you read Eugene's, and I think that to me was the real moment of, my goodness, I think you've been out there doing this. I think you found a way of making it work. So that's wonderful. He spent that time with you. We didn't have that that kind of benefit. So we really took his seance and made it into something which was slightly different, but still using the same underlying principles. And the question we always had was, these are very simple techniques, often developed during Victorian times. Would they fool a modern day audience? And on day one, we found out they absolutely would.
Yeah.
And it's so different to a magic show. With a magic show, you want as much happening as possible. With the seance work, it really is less is more.
That's
really
exactly
is.
right. Yeah, Eugene always talked to me about, you know, like I wanted to do a piece about Houdini, which Eugene didn't like that idea at all, but I won him over, and he said I wanted to use a wrapping hand because Eugene had used a wrapping hand, and Eugene said to me, the problem with the wrapping hand is this: when it wraps once, it's amazing. When it wraps twice, it's half as amazing. And the third time it wraps, they're looking at their watches. So we've got to conceive a routine for you where it only is going to wrap twice. That's it. Yes. We don't want it spelling anything out. We don't want it. So we worked together and conceived a routine that I did for years, where the wrapping hand only wrapped twice, and both time it got a gasp from the audience. And I would have completely mucked that up had it not been for Eugene saying less is more.
Oh, no, he completely understood. And also the frame around it. You don't want anyone, or at least I don't want anyone thinking they've gone to a genuine seance and genuinely been in touch with people who are no longer with us. But equally, you want them to have this wonderful experience. And so our frame, which I believe comes from Eugene's book, was, you know, we're going to do this reconstruction of a Victorian seance. I'm going to play the role of the medium, you're playing the role of the sitters, and then we just go straight into it. And I've been doing that for probably 100 or so shows. So, no, it's wonderful. I've just been in Vegas, actually, with an evening with Jeff McBride where we celebrated Eugene's genius. So, yeah, and I'm so glad to hear that he was so kind to you.
He really was. I mention him in every show. Towards the end of the show, as I'm going into the seance, I mentioned that everything, including the poem that I'm about to read, was introduced to me by a tremendous magician and medium named Eugene Berger, who is now on the other side. And Eugene, I hope you're pleased with what I'm doing. After all you taught me.
And of course that book came with that floppy disk, if you remember.
Yeah, of course.
I hear his voice.
I wore out my first copy and had to buy a second copy from him that did not have the floppy disk anymore. But yeah, he is not only the patron saint of this podcast, but he is, along with my brother, who is a magician, the two people I think most who influenced me as a performer.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure he'd be delighted to hear that. I mean, he's a very
sure hope so.
Guy. Yeah, lovely. Thank you.
Yeah.
So on the on your YouTube channel, Quirkology, which I'll have a link for in the show notes, which is another, not even an afternoon, maybe a couple days of sitting and watching everything on there. You have a lovely seance video. Can you talk about why you created that? What was your goal with that video?
Yes, that was very early on. People were doing those kind of recordings, which feel 3D, as it were. Feel like you're actually in the room rather than just listening to something. And we just thought seance was a good one. And I think some of the script in that video, we're going back quite a few years now, but some of the script is similar to the script in the actual seance that we used. So it was a fun thing to do. And since then, I'm based in Edinburgh, so we have the Edinburgh Festival every year. Other people have done full seance shows just using that setup. So everyone goes in, puts on the headphones and listens to one of those types of recordings for a half-hour show. And then at Magic Live and Blackpool, which are two huge magic conventions, we did our own version of the seance where we had 500 people in the hall. We took 10 of them into the seance room, but then had an infrared link back to the other 490 so they could see all the methods, the secret stuff, as it were, while the people in the seance room enjoyed the effect, you know, the magical moment. So I've been playing around with seance stuff all my life. There's something, it doesn't matter whether you're a skeptic or not, when there's the single candle lighting the room and you blow it out and you go to pitch darkness, the type of darkness that we don't normally experience, that is a moment. You can feel that in the room, that suddenly people realize how vulnerable they are and they're all holding each other's hands, which means they can't cover their face and hide and so on. So it's a wonderful, wonderful frame, I think, for exploring both psychology and magic.
When Jim did it the first time, this is early on when I knew him and I came to see it, and I also knew the woman doing the seance, and he did it in a cave, in a cavern within a cave. So you're in the cave and then you're further in, and there is nothing darker than the inside of a cave. It was really, really spooky. Nice job, Jim.
I have to say, it's the hardest thing to black out a room. So that, I mean, a cave is great, but not in a normal room. It's so difficult because every light source. And at Blackpool, we spent, I think, something like 3 hours blacking out the room. It's a really hard room to get completely black, but we managed to do it. And I said to everyone, oh my goodness, that's the hard part of the evening, the afternoon over. Sat down on a chair. The chair collapsed from under me. As I go back, I pour my coffee all down the only shirt that I've got for the show. And the entire afternoon became a lot harder at that point. We've done that. We also... I'm trying to think of a way of phrasing this without giving too much away. We have, because you work in total darkness, we have tactile signals so that if something's going wrong, there's ways in which the person playing the role of the medium can be informed of that. I did a show 10 years ago, I think, where quite a few famous magicians turned up to see this amazing Wiseman seance, and it went catastrophically wrong, such that we couldn't do any effect at all. We could do no magic. And so I got the signal, tactile signal, that actually we just got to close this whole thing down. So basically, they came into the room, they sat in darkness for 20 minutes. I lit a candle and said, that's it. And we left again. It was the most disappointing only second to the Coke Act or the juggling in Covent Garden or the Captain Fearless magic show. So it's a theme of disaster throughout my entire life.
Yeah.
You know, the thing that I think about a lot is when... in '86, when I started messing around with this stuff, Eugene was the only conduit, essentially. Then Tony Andruzzi and Tony Doc Shields had some stuff. But in terms of buying something or getting a prop, there just wasn't. And now there's a whole subset of magic.
Yes.
And prop makers who are making Ouija boards and bells that ring and stuff that you can get. And I really think they owe a great debt to Eugene, who sort of created this little window of magic.
And ironically, would never have used any of those props.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's so funny. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
Well, we were talking about the seance video also on Quirkology YouTube channel. There's one of your most popular videos is the color changing card trick, which Jim, do you want to just tell Richard your reaction to having watched that?
So I watched it, and as soon as the cards changed color, when you turned them over and it was a red back, my first reaction was, well, I'm going to have to buy that. I'm going to have to buy that trick and figure that out. And then when it's all revealed, I was chuckling beyond chuckling to see what you had achieved there. But the initial reaction was magical to me. It was like, oh my gosh, I need that in my repertoire.
That's very funny. Well, I was happy to sell you the deck. I have it over there. It's so odd. I mean, when I look back, I think when we all think about our lives, we think it's going to be the big things that change your life. But you know what? It was reading Dale Carnegie's book. It was watching my grandfather do a coin trick. It was seeing Eugene's close-up lecture, which then turned to the Spirit Theatre thing. Color changing card trick, the same thing. I'd got this idea for a video in my head for about 3 months. In the lab, we happened to have some downtime for an afternoon. I managed to persuade everyone to come together. At that point, YouTube wasn't that well known. It had been going for a couple of years. And we just stuck this video on it, and it got 250,000 views overnight. And that then became the start of the Quirkology channel. But it wasn't, I didn't have any of that in my mind. We just did stuff that we thought would be interesting to people. It turned out, to then really kick off an entire sort of genre, if you like, of video magic. So yeah, it was quite fun.
Not just video magic, but also perception beyond the magic. You're not really, the famous one that Jim and I probably saw the most, because it turned up at a lot of corporate events, and we both spent a lot of time either backstage or on stage at corporate events, was the basketball video with the gorilla.
Yeah.
And that was a great 5-minute time killer with an audience, because they would just be open mouth at the end. But you did have that kind of larger goal in mind when you made it. It wasn't just a magic trick.
No, I mean, the idea was that I love the complexity and the lateral thinking and the brilliance involved in magic. Problem is, you can't tell people about that stuff because it ruins the magic. So my goal was to create videos that celebrated the wonder of magic in the sense of the cleverness of the methods, but wouldn't upset magicians. And in whatever it's been, 20 years, we've never had one complaint from any magician, because they realize it's there to celebrate magic. It's let people know how magicians think, but in a way that doesn't undermine any magician performing any trick. So basically, we had to create our own effects and ones that would work on camera. And the color changing card trick was part of that. I remember showing it for the first time at Magic Live. I think may even be the first Magic Live, and showed it to a very well-known card magician. And they said, that is the worst color changing deck I have ever seen. It goes out of shot. You could have done anything. Why are you wasting my time with this? And then we showed in the second part, and I can't repeat the words that he used, because it's a whole string of foul language he's kind of so delighted, I think, that he'd missed all the changes. Yeah, long time.
I imagine there are a number of magicians who used similar techniques during lockdown for their Zoom shows, that you really were 20 years ahead of time on that. And we're being very oblique about what the video is. We're going to stay oblique about it. There'll be a link in the show notes. And if there isn't, if I've failed somehow to do that, you can find it on your Quirkology.
I'm sure it's out there. But yeah, and the idea of making quick videos as well was ours. And then we did another set of videos when the 59 Seconds book came out that were all less than a minute, which, because then the YouTube Shorts became that. So, I mean, I've always just done stuff that energizes me and gets me out of bed in the morning. If I'm interested in it, I'm assuming other people are as well. And if I'm not, I normally just leave it well alone.
Yeah. Well, it's great that with all your failure, you have turned them all into a successful career. Jumping off of seances a little bit, there's something, I'm probably getting it wrong, but I think you might have said on one of the podcasts that many of the parapsychologists became parapsychologists because something happened in their lives that they couldn't really explain. And that's why they went into it. You've done a lot of studies on ghosts and hauntings. Why were you drawn into that?
Because I find it interesting. It's that simple, but I don't believe a word of it, and that does separate me. So we should explain to folks, I did my psychology degree. I was then looking for a PhD, and at the same time, the guy called Professor Robert Morris, who's up in Edinburgh at the Curse of the Parapsychology Unit, was looking for someone to look into magic and the paranormal. And I've always had this interest in the paranormal. And so that's why I did my PhD for 4 years, and then I did lots of research into it. I've not been a believer, unlike most of the people in that field, but I do find it very interesting. I think when people say they've seen a ghost or had a dream that's come true or whatever it is, they're probably not lying to us. They are describing an experience, and I'm curious about what that experience was. And it's very interesting. When I was probably finishing my undergraduate years in psychology, I thought there's no point in looking at ghosts or telepathy because they don't exist. Why would you devote your life to that? And then I saw, again, just turned on the TV, and there was a psychologist on there called Sue Blackmore, and she said, rather than looking at whether these things exist, we can look at why people believe them. Why would they have these strange experiences? What are the impact of those beliefs on their lives? And that was a little light bulb moment. I thought, that's what I want to do. So I became, well, I've always been quite skeptical, but yeah, working in that field for probably 10 years, I think.
That's fascinating.
And you've done studies that have kind of given some reasons as to why things are happening, right? Some perhaps scientific reasons as to why everyone feels something in one spot.
Yeah, we've looked a lot at suggestibility. So if you put a bent key on the table and say, hey, look, it's still continuing to bend, we know about 40% of people see that bending, even though it's not bending. We've done a lot in the seance room. We know that believers tend to report all sorts of things there that didn't actually happen. We got a call from Hampton Court Palace, which is a royal palace down in London. They said they got a ghost and could we go along and investigate it? And so we spent 10 days, the first people to go into a royal palace and do a ghost hunt. And what we did there was to lead groups of people through and say, where do you think the ghosts are? And they put an X on the map, and they all agreed with one another. They all thought the ghosts were in the same place. You go to those places, they look like spooky places. So we looked at the way in which the environment can drive these ghostly experiences. So we've done loads of this stuff. And the challenge is always to try and put science in a way that still maintains the integrity of the experience you're looking at.
Now, as a skeptic, and I'd have to really kind of think through my belief system on that. But as a skeptic, have you encountered or found anything that you thought, well, what the heck happened there? Or how could that be real?
No, not really. I mean, you go to Blackpool Magic Live, I constantly see things that I can't explain. I constantly see tricks that I don't know the solution to. You go to, quotes, genuine seances or psychic, and normally it's terrible. And the reason for that is they're performing in a different frame. No one's going there with a skeptical frame of mind. They're going there to believe. And therefore, if there is trickery, it doesn't need to be as good, quite frankly. In fact, funny enough, I was saying the other day that I tested a professional psychic who gave psychic readings. And I said to him, what's the most annoying thing about being a psychic and working as a psychic? And he said, well, people make appointments and then don't turn up. And I thought, well, if you're a psychic, surely you should know. So it's led to lots of those kind of moments and lots of weird moments. But no, I've never seen oh my goodness, what's going on here? When I go to a magic convention, half my time is spent going, I've got no idea how that happened.
I'm fascinated by the subject matter, as you are and have been since I was a child. It's still something I read a lot about. It's something I have never ever had. I've had spooky experiences, but I've never seen a ghost. I've had dreams of people that have passed over that seem more than just a coincidence or a dream. I feel like maybe there was something there, but I would give my right arm to see a ghost and not be able to explain it.
Yeah, I've been in many, many allegedly haunted places and not seen a ghost. I can tell you that. But what I think is magicians don't realize how lucky they are for two reasons. One is community. Is that you can fly anywhere and meet up with a bunch of magicians and you just talk like your friends because you have this shared interest and so on. But the second is, if you're into the paranormal or magic, life's quite interesting. And lots of people don't have that. Their lives actually are not that interesting. But we have that kind of baked in. And so when you go to parties or whatever and say you're hunting for the Loch Ness Monster or ghosts or whatever it is, you realize that you're being blessed with an interesting hobby or set of interests.
Yes.
Agreed.
Agreed. I want to segue from that into a theatrical experience I had that I didn't know, but you were involved in. There's a play called Ghost Stories that my wife and I stumbled upon in the West End in London. It was in a big old theater. It was beautifully produced from the moment you walked in the door. The sound design, there was this is a beautiful old theater, and they'd done stuff to the walls in the auditorium itself. It was co-created by Andy Nyman, and I will tell you, he did a terrific job. I won't tell him. But he was the character of Professor Goodman, who I found out later is based on Professor Wiseman. And it was a truly entertaining and scary experience in that theater. It's a lovely, wonderful show. We came back a couple of years later, and they were doing it down the street at a little black box. And I had one of my favorite box office conversations ever. I came up to the box office and said, we saw this before. We'd like to see it again. Is it different at all? And the woman at the behind the counter said, well, Andy has said to tell people, yes, there are some new things. And I said, are there? And she said, no, it's the same show. And it was essentially the same show. It wasn't Andy doing it. But they made a movie out of it, and they wisely changed it quite a bit in the movie because it's now a movie experience and not a play experience. But the last minute and a half, 2 minutes of that play there is so much magic going on that isn't magic, but there's so much theatrical trickery happening that is so hidden and so seamless. And I mention that only because a couple of years ago, while in London, we saw a play version of The Exorcist, which had 10 times the effects, I suppose, that Ghost Story had. Ghost Story is actually pretty minimal up until that point. And the entire time as an audience member watching, all you could think was, they're killing themselves backstage. They are just running from thing to thing to thing to thing. And you could feel the actors pacing themselves to, they're not ready. They're not ready. They're not ready. Okay, now we're going to do the thing. Now we're going to do the thing. Terrible production, but really interesting in contrast to Ghost Stories, which was so modulated. My understanding is something that happened to you in your younger life is part of that show. Can you tell me what that was?
Yeah, I don't give too much away. So Andy and Jeremy, Andy I've known many, many years. They were writing the play and asked to meet up. And I think at that point, they were kind of struggling with a way of bringing everything together and so on. And so we met up, and I spoke about some of my research into ghosts, the fact that I did this ghost talk, and I think at some point, Andy asked what was the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. And I described this childhood experience, which is to do with, I wouldn't give away too much, but basically we did something as kids that was quite scary. And then they incorporated a lot of that into the play. So obviously the character, but the fact he's giving a talk on ghosts, the website that comes up is my website. I'm in that. So there is the photograph of me. There's a joke photograph that gets a laugh. I mean, that's me in it. So I appear in that every night. And then the final story is based on something that I did as a kid. So yes, it's interesting to see it. Yes.
One of the things that I missed in the movie, which was so fascinating, was the ghost lecture he gives at the beginning, where he has all those photos of people taking photos and looking at it and going, there's a ghost there. And there's one, I think it's at a wedding, where it looks like a normal photo. And then he says, look in that corner there. And the entire audience gasped, because it looks as if there is someone, a very strange looking person, peering out behind one of the subjects of the photo. And
if that's the photograph you're talking about, comes from my talk. So that is from the Science of Ghost talk, which is itself from the scienceofghost.com website, which I ran, where I asked people to send in ghostly photographs.
You know, I'm going to just deviate from the flight plan, because I saw in London a play called The Woman in Black, which probably is still running. And I think I am both a fairly experienced theater goer and have some onstage experience to draw from. But there was a moment in that show that elicited an audible scream from me. And it was a simple, he was reaching for a door that had been locked and now was open. And as his hand got to the doorknob, it slammed shut. The whole audience screamed, but unusual for me I think, to have that. And it was so simple.
Yes.
And when you talked about less is more, that's my touchstone for that. It doesn't take much, but
Yes.
boy, it's powerful.
But the context is really important. You have to build people up to that moment. And if you do too much, then they're in magic mode. They're in how's that done mode.
Right.
I think there's a real power to getting people to sticking in effect mode and not having them go, how's that done? So there isn't a how's that done. It's the symbolism of what it actually signifies that really matters. So yeah, it's a weird way. I think sometimes stuff that's weaker methodologically, and this runs in the face of magic thinking, but stuff that's weaker methodologically can have a more powerful impact on people because it stops them flipping over into how that's done. And at that moment, they're outside the play now. They've left their play.
So you've got, I'll put links in the show notes to all the books. I would recommend them all. But you have a new one that is essentially aimed for kids, right?
First kids book I've done, which was very, very exciting. I've always wanted to try and find a way of making magic work for kids. And of course, there are loads of great kids books on magic. I never wanted to compete with that. And then a few years ago, I started to look at the research on how magic is good for people. And we look at our own lives. And magic, certainly for me, has played this enormously positive role in terms of confidence and social skills and networking and creativity. And so I've taken my self-help stuff. I've taken my magic stuff. I put it together into a book where kids are learning magic tricks, I hope good tricks, but they're also learning all those things: confidence, social skills, creativity, critical thinking, even sort of straight, how to make life more interesting. All those sorts of things are really important. And that's what the new book is. So I'm very excited about it.
Did you test it on kids? Do you have some beta readers?
No one, absolutely no one has read it. I'm the only person that's read it. I doubt it works, quite frankly. And no, it's like all my books, I tested it on no one but myself. What I did do was choose a bunch of tricks that I would have wanted to learn when I was a kid, and I hopefully presented them in a more interesting way, in a more interesting context. So, you know, the chapters are on the skills that you might need to be a good magician. And so for confidence, for example, we take a trick, we learn a basic version of it. Once you mastered that, you move on to something a bit harder. Then you look at variations and so on. And you slowly build up the confidence. Now that gives you a kind of template for learning anything. If you jump in at the deep end and fail, well, that's the end of your confidence. And so the idea here is that you're learning real skills that can affect your life through the lens of a wonderful pastime, which is magic. But it is kind of amazing. The one thing we're really encouraging kids to do is to put down screens, to move away from looking at tablets and their smartphones, realize there are other people in the world who are quite interesting, and that you can actually interact with those other people and show them something amazing. So it is about using your hands, which seems to be a skill we've kind of forgotten, but magicians know a great deal about. And it's really about connecting with other people and working hard in order to give them a wonderful experience. So it's not so much about method. It's thinking, how can you give this gift to somebody else? A wonderful, wonderful experience where they go, oh, wow. What does that take? Well, it turns out it takes a whole lot of skills which are going to be useful in many aspects of your life.
So, as he said, and he says it in his own podcast, it all comes back to magic. Everything that he is, all the tendrils of his interests, all kind of go back to that core interest in magic.
Isn't that weird how some small thing that you think, you put no emphasis on necessarily becomes sort of your whole life's work? His grandfather does a magic trick, and that sets him on this course, which leads him to that course, which now it's his whole deal.
It's a Back to the Future kind of a thing.
It
One
really
little
is.
thing just
And
made it
off
all
we
happen.
go.
And off
Yeah.
we go.
And I suppose if you and I sat down with ourselves or together, we could start to deconstruct or reconstruct or look back and try to find what was the moment that set me on this path. I don't have the time or the interest, frankly, to look at my own life. I'd be happy to do it with you if you're interested. But it just, I love talking to the man. He's so smart, so fun, so knowledgeable. And what I think the greatest part about it is finding all these videos that he has created
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that you can watch that are just like, what the heck? So good stuff, really good stuff. And I appreciate you introducing me to the man.
There will be a link, like I said earlier, to his podcast in the show notes. We'll also have a link to his YouTube website, Quirkology, which has, I think, literally hundreds of videos. I'll also put in a link to I think I found the original basketball / gorilla video that I know I saw at corporate events in the 80s. I think I found that one. There's several more out there now. People have recreated it. And I also will have a link to his ghost site, which I don't know if the listener's interested, but I know that Jim Cunningham should go and click on that.
Absolutely.
People send in pictures of what they think are ghost sightings, and generally their reflections or double exposures, but they are very interesting, and that led Andy Nyman to co-create the play Ghost Stories. The movie Ghost Stories was Richard Wiseman's work on ghosts. So really fascinating. Looking forward to going out and grabbing his new kids book, Magic Your Mind Happy, which is about making people feel better about themselves.
Fantastic.
Yep, smart stuff.
Yeah.
I was also surprised at the overlap between you and he on Eugene Berger and Spirit Theater.
I was too, and delighted to talk to somebody who has lived that book. It's a tremendous book. I couldn't tell you honestly if it's even still available now after Eugene has passed, if they've done a reprinting or if there are still copies out there that you could get your hands on if it's something you're interested in. But it's a great book for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is it changed my life.
Well, yeah, and later this season we'll have a chat with Jamie Ian Swiss, who was one of maybe 3 people, you're one of the other 2 in this country to take Spirit Theater and put it on its feet after Eugene had done it. And it sounds like overseas, Richard Wiseman was one of the guys who also did that at that time. So you're in a special club there.
I like the club, and I'm a privileged member, and I've nobody but the patron saint of this podcast to thank for it, Eugene Berger. Although, as I mentioned, I think in the interview, my brother had an enormous influence on me as a performer, as a person, almost a second father to me in many ways. So my brother too gets the lion's share of the credit, but Eugene. So if my brother is Obi-Wan, then Eugene is Yoda, and he sort of completed the training that my brother started.
Does that make me Darth Vader, or?
I think, well, you're certainly not Jar Jar Binks.
Me don't like that.
You could be C-3PO, maybe.
That feels good.
That is good.
That's a glove that fits.
Yeah.
A couple other things that he mentioned that I wanted to talk to you about now after the fact. One is how hard it is to make a room actually dark, and you had the advantage of doing your version of Spirit Theater in a cave.
But I have done it in other places. The first place I did it was at St. Anthony, Maine, in an old storefront. And the second place, or the last place I did it, was at Dudley Riggs ETC on Seven Corners. Both places, not a cave, and both places it takes you hours and hours and hours. Because Eugene, his philosophy was, if there's a pinpoint anywhere in the room, you get a frame of reference, and it's not nearly as scary. So you got to turn off the lights. You got to let your eyes adjust completely. You got to find the light leak, shine a flashlight on it, turn the lights on, plug that leak, turn off the flashlight, turn off the lights, let your eyes adjust. I mean, it takes hours and hours and hours to get it right. But if you get it right and you are in total, utter darkness, it is absolutely debilitating. You lose that sense, and so many things can then happen to you that are startling. I mean, it's not just sneaking up on you, but you just literally can't see things coming. So when they arrive, it's a surprise, boy, and it's a spooky, scary surprise.
Okay, so let me ask you this, because he talked about that the frame of a magic show is different from the frame at a seance. And you've done Spirit Theater, as it turns out, in 3 locations that you made completely dark. And now you do a variation on that show in a space that you cannot get. I don't even think you attempt to make it.
I don't even try.
You don't even try. How does that change the frame of what you're doing?
It changes it significantly. So my version of Hauntings was different from Eugene's version of Hauntings, which was different from Jamie Ian Swiss's version of Hauntings, which I'm sure was different from Richard Wiseman's. I mean, it's all filtered, and Eugene wanted it this way, filtered through the performer, which I think, as we have talked in this podcast straight across the board, almost every performer that we've talked to said, well, you got to kind of make it your own, and it has to be. And so Eugene was right. You got to filter this through yourself. I was a kid of 30 at the time, or less than 30, and he was a man with a huge beard, and so he could carry off both ends of, and I wasn't really a magician. So my bent always, and I think Eugene warmed to it, but it took a while. My bent was to come at it comedically, as I think I mentioned in the interview, is to say, how could people be so silly to fall for something like this? And then with Eugene's help, present them with a mystery that they'd go, well, gosh, how did that writing get there? How did he know that piece of information if it wasn't through some sort of ghostly interaction? So the idea now for me, now the game is expanded. So I'm an older performer, and I can do both what I sort of have made a career such as it is out of doing, which is being glib and light and funny, and I hope charming on stage. And present people with mysteries that they can't explain other than there's a ghost in the room somewhere. I can't see it, but it's there. So when I go to the seance part of the show, I have to, in order to balance that now as a performer without a medium, I have to fight against my natural impulse, which is to make things funny. So I have to soften that edge of myself so that I can hold some sort of credibility in the back half of the show. So I have to make it all be an arc, where before I could simply go full out and then turn the thing over to Catherine, the medium, and the audience in a few minutes was looking around. Where's that guy? Where's the funny guy? Why did he leave us with this scary woman? I don't have that luxury anymore. So now I have to carry both ends, and not being able to darken the room completely makes it more of a challenge to get the same kinds of effects. I seldom get screams in this version of the show, where we would always get screams when it was dark, because we could startle people, and we did startle people. But there were other things that happened that elicited screams. I seldom get screams now, but I do get gasps, and I do get a level of buy-in that I might not get in sort of a thrill ride, the way we used to do it in the total darkness, where I think in the total darkness, people immediately go into puzzle mode and say, well, I know it's not real. It's fun. It's like a haunted house, and I'm screaming and things are happening, but I don't really think there's a ghost. In this sort of dim light seance, things are happening that they can see. And I think I get, based on the discussions I have with audience members after the show, the questions aren't, how did you do that? But, or, oh boy, that was really spooky and scary and fun, but rather, so you think there are 3 ghosts that live in this building? And so there's a level of buy-in that this version of the show produces that I didn't get in the other version of the show. Neither, it's a horse apiece, whatever kind of experience you want to create. But I was surprised at the level of and you have documentation on these three ghosts, and that is an interesting phenomenon for me, is that what I thought would be lesser in some ways psychologically is greater for an audience.
Well, that's something Richard Wiseman needs to do a study on.
Well, that'd be great. If he's listening to this, maybe he'd like to come over.
Yeah.
We'd love to have you. I'd love to have dinner with him for 6 hours.
He was great to talk to. Go to the links I've given you, pick up his new book. And speaking of books, while we're here, we might as well go ahead and.
That's right. That's what we're here for. It's time to get down to business. I'm ready. I'm raring to go to read chapter 9, but you got to just kind of get us caught up again. What happened in chapter 8?
Well, chapter 8, they were setting up for Quentin Moon's lecture. He arrived with Franny and Megan. He did his lecture. Harry left during one explanation because he didn't want to know how it's done. Eli chatted with Deirdre, learned more about the projectionist. He got to watch Quentin sell products in the store and see how great he is at that. And then he drove him back to the hotel. And that takes us right into chapter 9.
Chapter 9. I'm a very moral man, except, of course, when it comes to collecting. Is that what you told the police? Not in those words. Chip Kavanaugh said this with a winning smile, which I suspect had gotten him out of many a scrape in the past. We were in the sunken living room of his penthouse apartment off Mears Park in downtown St. Paul. His phone number was the first of 2 Deirdre had dictated to me, and I called him after dropping Quentin Moon off at his hotel. Chip said he was available to chat right then, and his apartment was only blocks away, so it seemed like the stars had aligned for this conversation. Before going into the building, I had done some quick research on Chip Kavanaugh via my phone. I saw at once why the name was familiar. As the middle son of one of the richest families in the Twin Cities, I had heard about him virtually my whole life, even though we were likely about the same age. Like another local family, the Pillsburys, the Kavanaugh name had become synonymous with the business they ran. In their case, a large, privately held bank, the old and prestigious Kavanaugh Bank in downtown St. Paul. A quick Google search of Chip showed him at various charitable functions over the years, always with a different beauty on his arm and the same self-satisfied smirk on his face. The photos, which weren't from charity events, generally showed him at the helm of a large boat on Lake Minnetonka, or captaining a yacht in some far-flung sea race, with rich white guys fiercely competing against other rich white guys. I didn't come across any scandals, just article after article about how Chip, of all the Kavanaugh children, did surprisingly little except travel the world, sail boats, and look after the family's massive art collection. Despite being a confessed lover of art, there was precious little on display in the impressive large white-walled living room. In addition to the 3 blank walls, the apartment also sported a floor-to-ceiling window, which offered a stunning view of downtown St. Paul, with the frozen river visible to the left and the dome of the cathedral up and off in the distance. And distance was something I was keeping from that window. I am no fan of heights, less so in the last few months, but still enough that I avoided them whenever possible. "Come look at the view," Chip suggested after he had taken my coat and offered me a drink. "After all, I'm paying a fortune for it," he added with a laugh. He was shorter than I had anticipated, but solid and muscular, probably from years of playing lacrosse and water polo or similar sports I couldn't afford and didn't understand. "Thanks, but I'm good here." I decided to not go into any explanation of my recent panic attacks in high places, or of my months of therapy, which had basically devolved into the therapist finally throwing up his hands and suggesting I simply stay away from high places. I had heartily agreed with this clever plan of action, bid the good doctor farewell, and had since really suffered no serious setbacks using this common-sense approach. Suit yourself. So, what's your connection to this case? Chip asked as he crossed the room and took a seat in a matching chair across from the couch. Despite the frigid air outside, he was dressed as if for a tropical party, sporting leather sandals, khakis, and an understated Tommy Bahama shirt. Just like Clifford Thomas, he had a tan, which was not only out of season, but also appeared to have been gathered on a faraway beach. The cops weren't entirely clear on your involvement in this whole brouhaha. Neither am I admitted. He saw me glance at a bowl of nuts on the table between us and pushed it in my direction. It had been a long time since breakfast, and somehow lunch had eluded me. The amount of nuts I grabbed balanced on that delicate fulcrum between the most I thought I could politely take while being the very least amount I wanted to eat. Friend of the victim? He offered. I shook my head, sorting the peanuts from the almonds from the cashews as I quickly arranged them in the order I planned to eat them. I found, or I guess I saw, the body, I explained between bites. So you're a person who's interested in the persons of interest, he suggested with a twinkle in his eyes. I think that's the case, I agreed. Like Thompson, the reporter. Excuse me? Thompson, the reporter in Citizen Kane, trying to develop a post-mortem picture of the late Tyler James by talking to people who knew him. Yes, I suppose that's what I'm doing, I agreed. So why are you a person of interest? He shrugged. According to the police, because I used Tyler James's services in the past. My collecting is focused mostly on the art world, but from time to time I've shown an interest, some would say an obsessive interest, he added with a laugh, in the world of movie memorabilia. What sort of things did you buy through Tyler? James, Tyler. I gave up on the whole name thing and ate some nuts. The police asked that same question, he said, still smirking. And what did you tell them? I was down to the cashews and wished I had taken more. I sort of took the fifth on that one, he said. You know, the one about self-incrimination. I was chewing, so he continued. From time to time, I purchased some treasures from Tyler, which were not actually on the market, so to speak. Again, the smirk. I looked from Chip to the huge window behind him, noticing, for the first time, a particular skyscraper which was dead center in the view. The home base for the Kavanaugh Bank. I understand you're in charge of buying art for your family's bank's collection. I oversee those purchases, he said, primarily because my brothers have not taken a very strong interest in the arts or collecting. You're more active in collecting? More sneering. Much more active. I couldn't help glancing around the room at the bare, stark walls. He watched me, his smile getting even wider. And you have a personal collection? I do. Where do you keep it? He shrugged. Around. Well, probably in his late 30s, Chip's attitude was that of a teenager with a very funny little secret he was keeping from the world, or from me. He ran a hand casually through his thick head of hair and settled back further into his chair. There was a long pause as I considered where to take the conversation next. He continued to chuckle throughout. I felt enough time had passed, so I took a second handful of nuts, nudging as many cashews as possible into my hand. You said earlier you're a very moral man, except when it comes to collecting. What did you mean by that? He leaned forward, seeming engaged, for the first time since I had arrived. Mr. Marks, do you collect anything? You mean besides debts and parking tickets? No, I mean, seriously, collecting something like stamps, coins. I said, thinking about it. When I was a kid, I remember I loved Mad Magazine, and I tried to collect all the issues. That is until I found out how many of them there were and how much the older ones cost. Sadly, scarcity drives the economics of these things, he said. Then, of course, I had to own the entire set of Tarbell. Tarbell? It's a set of magic books, the Tarbell Course in Magic, 8 volumes total. There's a saying in the magic community that if you think you've invented a new idea, look in Tarbell, because you probably haven't. And did you ultimately collect the full set, all 8 books? I did, I said, and they're still on my bookshelf. If I were a better magician, I added, thinking about Quentin Moon, I would take them down and study them more often. See, you understand the joys of collecting a group of things, a set. There are many people out there like that. Completists. For me, the fun comes in collecting something singular, where there is one, and only one. Art? Art, yes. Movie memorabilia, by all means. Whatever catches my fancy. What might catch your fancy? You mean hypothetically. His arch tone matched his eyebrows as he practically winked at me. Sure, I said, playing along. Hypothetically. Hypothetically, then, he said, turning to his right and gazing at the white wall on the far side of the room. I'd love to be the one who owns Picasso's Les Pigeons à Petits Pois. He saw my puzzled expression and kindly translated for me. The pigeon with green peas? Never heard of it. What's stopping you? It was stolen in 2010. The thief says he panicked and threw the painting in a dumpster. A dumpster? That could happen, he said with a shrug, then turned his head to the left and got a dreamy look in his eyes. I'd also love to have Van Gogh's View of the Sea at Scheveningen. I was about to ask the obvious question, but he beat me to it. Also stolen, he said without looking at me, still staring at that point on the blank wall. 2002, he added. He continued to gaze almost lovingly at the wall. I felt for a moment that I was intruding on something intimate. How about movie memorabilia? I asked, hoping a new category might pull him from his reverie. He turned back to me. That's a very limited area in my mind, he said. Not a lot of holy grails out there. With one exception, of course. He smiled broadly and then whispered, Rosebud. The sled from Citizen Kane? I thought there was more than one of those out there. Chip shook his head. They made 3 for the movie. They shot 2 takes of the final shot of the sled going into the fire, so 2 of them were burned. But didn't somebody famous buy the 3rd one? Like Spielberg or something? He may think he bought it, but word on the street is the one he got is a fake. Which means he looked over my head at the blank wall behind me, which means it could still be out there somewhere. Again, a long, loving gaze, which was just this side of creepy. But this sort of collecting doesn't really make sense, does it? How do you mean? He didn't look at me, and I could tell I still didn't have his complete attention. Well, these are all things that if you had them, you could never tell anyone you had them, right? Being stolen and all. He continued to stare at the wall. I could make my peace with that, he said. Sometimes just the having is all. How about London After Midnight? Does it have any interest for you? The police asked that very same question, he said, turning back toward me. However, as I remember, it was phrased differently, and their tone was nowhere near as nice as yours. Did you have any interest in it? I'll tell you what I told the police. Tyler approached me, as I imagine he approached a lot of people. He said he might have access to the only surviving print of the movie, and he wanted to know if I was interested. Were you? I heard the siren call of the bowl of nuts and reached forward, taking another handful from the side of the dish which seemed to offer the greatest number of cashews. I considered it, he said, but in the end, I didn't pursue it, which I also told the police, he added. Why not? You'd have the only one. True enough, he agreed, But a bunch of film reels doesn't hold the same visceral, visual appeal for me. In order to get any real pleasure out of these things, I need to be able to see them physically in front of me. A film print, as alluring as its unique individual status may be, just doesn't do it for me. And that's what you told the police? Essentially. To be honest, I'm not sure they understand my need to collect, so I didn't go into much detail with them. Certainly not as much as I've told you. He flashed a smile which was both sincere and sad. I got the sudden impression that behind the smile, he was actually sad most of the time. All right then, he continued, visibly putting his cheerful self front and center. Anything else? Sure, one last question. Does your family belong to the Summit Club? He thought about this for a moment. Belong? I think that's too weak a word. My great-grandfather was one of the founding members. Not that I spend much time there. A little too stuffy for my liking. Mr. Marks, is that all you needed? The fact he stood up while saying this suggested if this weren't all I needed, it would have to suffice, as it was all I was going to get. I stood up and moved toward the door with Chip Kavanaugh right behind me. I have to admit, he said, I still don't fully understand your role in all of this. I stopped at the door and turned. To be honest, Mr. Kavanaugh, I don't either. But the sense I'm getting is that, for your part, you had virtually no role in this. That's what I tried to explain to the police. However, I must admit, you seemed more open to that scenario than they did. That sounds like a compliment, so I'm going to say thank you. I reached for the door handle, but stopped when he put his hand on my arm. Eli, you seem like a man I can trust. I'm a pretty good judge of character, and that's the sense I'm getting. Thank you, I said again slowly, not at all sure where this was headed. You want to see something? His voice was low and his tone conspiratorial. He smiled at me, and I think he even winked. Maybe, I said without conviction. He moved past me to the other side of the door frame, reaching toward the light switch plate. Instead of flicking the final switch in the row, he gave it a slight pull, and the entire plate opened on a hinge, revealing yet another row of switches recessed in a small opening. This is just between you and me, okay? I nodded slowly, glancing down at the door handle and quickly calculating how fast I could pull the door open and dart down the hallway. He turned back toward the room and looked at the white wall to our left. He glanced at me and tilted his head in the direction of the wall. As I turned, I heard him flip a switch, and suddenly the wall disappeared. It was there one moment and gone the next. I realized it was not an actual plaster wall, but glass that had by some electronic means been frosted white, given the impression of being a solid wall. Now, after the switch had been flipped, I saw it was a wall of clear glass, encasing another wall about 2 feet behind it. On the center of the wall was a large framed painting. It looked cubist to my uneducated eye, primarily because much of it was made up of gold and gray cubes. The word cafe was written in the top right corner. From this distance, I didn't see any pigeons, and even though I couldn't see the signature, it somehow felt like a Picasso painting. Given the way Chip Kavanaugh was looking at the framed piece, it most likely was. After a long moment, Chip tilted his head toward the wall on the right, and I heard him flip another switch. The frosted glass was immediately transparent, revealing another large framed painting on the interior wall. It showed a ship in the distance, the seashore, and dark figures in the foreground. The thick swatches of paint and wavy lines screamed Van Gogh, but again, what do I know? I looked at Chip Kavanaugh, but he did not return my look. Instead, he gazed longingly at the painting. He exhaled, caught my eye, and then tilted his head at the wall behind me. I turned just as the frosted glass disappeared and found myself face to face, as it were, with a piece of movie history. Hanging on the interior wall, inches away from me, albeit behind a thick pane of glass, was a small, fragile-looking child's sled. I read the name stenciled on the front of the sled, unconsciously slipping into a hoarse whisper as I did so. Rosebud. On the drive back to Minneapolis, I considered the two suspects I'd met so far. Both rich, both eccentric, both living in what appeared to be their own little worlds. Each used his considerable wealth to fuel his hobbies, and each seemed obsessed enough in their little worlds that stepping outside it in the name of murder, while not likely, still didn't seem completely out of the question. Throughout it all, I couldn't help think of a plaque we had trouble keeping in stock in the small section of Chicago Magic devoted to gag gifts. Amid the fart spray and fake dog vomit was a series of posters and plaques which sold far better than most of the magic tricks we were ostensibly there to sell. The bestseller, hands down, was the image of a quartet of rotund animated men, each holding their sides with laughter. The side-splitting caption above them explained their mirth-filled state. You want it when? But the plaque I couldn't shake from my consciousness after spending some time with Clifford Thomas and Chip Kavanaugh was a perennial favorite found in offices across the land. It read, "You don't have to be crazy to work here, but it helps." Based on these two most recent encounters, coupled with other odd experiences in the past year, I was getting the sense you didn't have to be crazy to be rich, but it certainly helped. I was still mulling this over when I pulled my car into a slushy spot in front of the magic shop. Dusk had fallen, and the street seemed unusually dark even for a late January afternoon. I had just opened the car door when my phone buzzed on the seat next to me. The caller ID read unknown caller, and I considered letting it go to voicemail, but it was cold outside and the car was still warm, so I shut the door and answered the phone. This is how decisions are often made during long, cold Minnesota winters.
Mandrake, how does life find you on this fine snowy evening?
Any warmth I had been feeling left my body at that instant, driven by a primal and Pavlovian response to the voice of Mr. Lime, which had taken hold of my central nervous system without even stopping to ask permission. I cleared my throat and struggled to sound relaxed and at ease. I was neither. "Mr. Lime, good to hear from you," I said with what sounded to me like forced cheer. "How are you doing?"
What a coincidence. I called to ask you that very question,
he said, his thin, reedy voice sounding far more substantial than my own.
I understand you were quite recently the victim of what they call a near miss. I hope you are suffering no ill effects from the encounter with an errant automobile.
How'd you hear about that? I asked, immediately recognizing the futility of the question.
I have my fingers in a number of pies,
he said, and I could see him smiling at the metaphor.
Some stickier than others. I must say, my boy,
he continued, sounding much more avuncular than I would have preferred,
when I asked you to take on this endeavor, I did so thinking it would not put you in harm's way. Please accept my apologies. It has never been my wish to see harm come to you.
You and I have that in common, I said. This produced a low chuckle from the other end of the phone, and then silence. I waited it out for a moment, and then had to fill the quiet gap. "So," I began, and was immediately cut off.
The good news, of course, is you are unharmed,
he said, once again seizing control of the conversation.
The other news is an incident such as the one you experienced often means you're heading in a productive direction.
I considered this for a moment. But, I said as a thought occurred to me, when the car tried to run me down, I hadn't talked to any of the suspects yet.
True enough. he said with another low chuckle. But you had said yes to the enterprise, and sometimes in this world, just saying yes can set the wheels in motion, as it were.
Another pause, and another attempt by me to fill it. So, I repeated, and once again this was enough to jumpstart the conversation.
Be assured, I will investigate further, he said. For the time being, I suggest you maintain your course. Keep an eye peeled. As they say, there be dragons here. And sometimes they be right.
There was the slightest sound of a click, and then once again nothing. I truly couldn't tell if he had ended the conversation or not. So, I ventured again, but this time, the only response was silence. I was still considering his opaque warning as I navigated the steep, snowy mounds which separated the street from the sidewalk. I wasn't really paying attention to much more than where my feet were landing, so it took a moment for me to realize the standard form of lighting, which generally blanketed the front of the store in the early evening, was not currently providing illumination of any sort. The marquee for the movie theater, which normally lit up several doors on either side of the cinema, was dark, as was the theater lobby. I checked my watch, thinking I might have completely lost track of time, but it was only 7:10 p.m. Under normal circumstances, the theater should have been open for business by now. The ladder Tracy had been using earlier in the afternoon had been haphazardly abandoned, splayed across the doors to the theater. The box of black metal letters which had hung from the ladder had been pushed to the curb, with several letters protruding from the snow. However, the most unsettling element, which was visible even in the dim light, was what was staining the icy sidewalk beneath the marquee. Partially frozen, but still sticky and viscous, was a disturbingly large pool of blood. There be dragons, indeed.
All right, so there's blood on the ground in front of the Parkway Theater. There is that is a real theater, by the way. Parkway
Absolutely.
Theater in that location. In fact, a few years ago when Joe Manjaris owned it, he and I toured through it because we were having lunch and chatting about stuff. And he pointed out that there actually was a small store, a candy store, adjacent to the theater, and then it was absorbed into the theater. But where Chicago Magic would stand, there actually was a little store right there. It wasn't as big as Chicago Magic, but in the old days, it was there, and then it was eventually incorporated into the theater itself. Anyway, so if you're in Minneapolis and you wander down Chicago Avenue, you can see the Parkway Theater. It is still there. If you look at where the box office sits, that used to be a little candy store somewhere, I believe on the our YouTube channel for Eli Marks for this podcast. The video animation of The Last Customer opens with an animated shot where you can see the Parkway Theater where Chicago Magic sits in the restaurant next door. It's been imagined as to where it would be, but it isn't really there. It's in that empty space in between the two. Anyway, that is it for this episode. That's episode 409. Next time, we're going to do a jump into the Wayback Machine, and we're going to revisit some thoughts from our friend Tina Leonard.
Genius.
Yeah. And then we'll listen to chapter 10. I don't want to over preview what Tina's going to say. It's taken from our interview with her 2 years ago. She was so nice to do it because, as she admitted to us, she doesn't really like doing it. And she's sort of like John Carney that way. They were both very nice. They don't love doing podcasts, but they were nice enough to sit with us for an hour and chat. So we'll hear some interesting things about Tina Leonard and the creation of Mothman next time, and then listen to chapter 10 of The Miser's Dream. So please join us then.
I will. I know I will. I'm pretty sure I will. I'm almost positive I will.
Yeah, we need to talk.
Take care, everybody.
This has been Behind the Page, the Eli Marks podcast, with your hosts, John Gaspard and Jim Cunningham. Produced by Alberts Bridge Books at Grass Lake Studios. Find this podcast and all the books in the Eli Marks series at elimarksmysteries.com. That's ELIMARKS Mysteries.com.
And thanks for listening.